You guys said that you think Peterson is somewhat of a reductionist and not really covering the right quadrants in this book. This is partly right, but I think it's also intentional. I mean, the goal of this book is to give you a basic tool set that helps you become a person. I think this is one of his strengths, as opposed to Sam Harris, by both acknowledge consciousness as a reality. I think Peterson has much more to say about how to build a personality, how to make a personality work. He has much more to say about specific incentives and what attitudes to have towards life, what specific steps to take if you want to become a person. Being a person is not trivial. Being a functioning ego is not trivial, and he deals with it a lot in his clinical work. There are so many things that can go wrong on this account, in this area, and there's so much to be said just about how to do it right, how to be a person, how to be an ego. And the ego, in the Western tradition has a very positive connotation. The ego is not so much meant as attachment, but much more the ego has the meaning of being that which sustains, that which is able to sustain a sort of coherence over time, that which is able to cohere also in its own perspective on world. So you don't come up with random views, but you try to be coherent about your views. The ego is also an agent, as integral theory would put it. The ego is your sense of being able to choose. It is your sense of being able to stay with difficult situations. If you know it is important to stay with difficult situations and face some kind of challenge. Pre-egoic consciousness is not able to commit in this kind of way. It cannot commit either to topics, it cannot commit to development, and it cannot commit to other persons in this way. The ego is also that which builds relationships to other selves, that which commits to other selves. The ego has largely positive meaning in the Western psychological tradition. So what he's trying to build is a functioning ego, and the best case scenario of which is you become an agent who is able to recognize himself as an ego, to recognize himself as a conscious agent, has become in part self-transparent to himself. Remember that the goal in psychotherapy, in Freud, is to make everything ego that so far was unconscious. So the state of unconsciousness is the starting point, where you're driven by specific motives you're not aware of, but the ending point is to make everything ego, to make everything transparent. And this is a very, very different way of using the term than it is usually used in Buddhism. This is the major goal, I think, of the work itself, the book itself. I think it's legitimate, and in this light I think it's not surprising that most of his suggestions and most of his incentives are actually left quadrant oriented. It comes with the territory, it comes with what the phenomenon was actually like, with the structure of the phenomenon. And I don't see Peterson denying the existence of the right quadrants, nor do I see him denying complexity as such. What I see him saying is that you can learn to become a person even without having been able to fully grasp the complexity of the world around you. You can become an agent who is able to develop and who is able to become aware of his own shadow and integrate it without necessarily taking a right hand approach, a right quadrant approach to reality, which is much more complex, and where we are really very far from having figured things out. building a personality in this way is simply simpler. It's easier than dealing with all the quadrants, and it's a logical starting point, because whatever kind of perspective you take on the right quadrants, it is the ego that is taking up the perspective. And if it lacks self-awareness, if it lacks the ability to see how it gets to its own conclusions and how it makes meaning of the world, this is also one of the leitmotifs in his work. Peterson tries to teach you how you make sense of the world, and how there can be different ways of making sense of the world. And if you're not aware of that, your conclusions will be self-forgotten. You will not be seeing how you get to a conclusion from a starting point, and the starting point always is some kind of meaning making, which is in the end subjective. So this is where I see him, or how I see him framing the book, and it seems a legitimate approach to me.